Hey guys, welcome to Pounds Invested. I'm your host, Stephen Georgiev. So we've had the coronavirus lockdown, and today, July the 4th, marks the day in which, in England at the very least, swathes of the economy are opening back up again. Pubs are open, bars are open, hairdressers can open, and goodness knows we need those. Cinemas can open. So now that the economy is getting back to normal again, I think it's worth discussing how on earth we're going to end up paying for all the extra government spending that the government has been forced into over the past 6 or so months. Stick around and find out. Before we get into today's video, I really want to thank those of you who have subscribed to my channel already and have seen my previous videos. If you're new around here, go and check those out. So by far the biggest plank of the UK government's coronavirus bailout has been the furlough scheme, the scheme by which the government has paid 80% of the wages of ordinary working people. This hasn't come cheap though. It's totalling around about £14 billion per month. Next, there's the business rates holiday, which has meant that incorporated businesses haven't paid as much tax on their premises. This has totaled to around about £16 billion. Thirdly, there's the bounce back loan scheme, through which the government is lending money at incredibly low rates to businesses to see them through the economic downturn brought about by the coronavirus shutdown. This is totalling around about £40 billion of loans at a measly 1% interest. For the self-employed, there's a scheme through which they're entitled to a proportion of their profits for the next few months. This has come in at around about £10 billion. There's also a small business grant scheme. This is totalling around about £15 billion. Lastly, there's an extra £16 billion so far announced for additional public services like our NHS and our firefighters. So if you add all of this up, we're looking at around about an extra £300 billion worth of government spending. That's 3 and 11 zeros. 11 zeros! What on earth is going on here? Well, let's put that into context. One Queen Elizabeth II aircraft carrier costs £4 billion. Small change really. Feeling hungry? For your £300 billion, you could buy 191,082,803 McDonald's cheeseburgers. It'll sure cure your McDonald's fix for a while. But what does £300 billion look like when spread over every man, woman and child in the country? Well, per head of the population, the government has spent £4,615. Not exactly small change, I'm sure you'll agree. So given all of this money's been spent, how are we going to pay for it going forwards? Well, the government largely has 3 levers it can pull: spending cuts, tax rises and borrowing. Let's have a look first at spending cuts. Now, one option on the table is a public sector pay freeze, which would see nurses, doctors, firefighters, police and so on have their pay frozen. This might not be politically viable, however, purely because we owe such a debt of gratitude to our emergency services workers during these uncertain times. One controversial project that the government has so far been quite keen to fund has been high-speed rail, so-called HS2. For those of you not in the UK, HS2 is a new rail link linking London to the north of England. This has so far cost around about £106 billion. So if we were to cancel HS2 and reroute that £100 or so billion towards paying part of the coronavirus bill, that would still leave us with around about £200 billion worth of money to find. So if the money can't be raised by public spending cuts alone, let's have a look next at tax rises. Tax rises, I'd say, are quite likely, sadly, but it's a balancing act for the government because they don't want to be hitting people and businesses when they're just starting to recover after the coronavirus shutdown. Now, tax rises, alongside being politically unpopular, may be politically challenging for the government to try to implement. This is because in the election last year, the government announced that it would not be raising income tax, VAT or national insurance. Though I suppose the Chancellor could just say that the coronavirus crisis has presented him with extenuating circumstances in which unpopular decisions about tax rises previously ruled out may well be revisited. Now, the third option that the government has is to borrow more, I'd say this is by far the most likely of the three options. But we already know that the UK government is in quite a lot of debt. Just have a look at this graph over here. We can see that the UK debt to GDP ratio recently crossed over 100%. So what that means is that the UK's public debt is now just over 100% of the total economic output of the country. The last time this happened was 1963. So quite a while ago then. But do investors really care that the UK government is in so much debt already? Well, I'd argue not, no. As we can see from this graph right here, we can see that the UK government may well choose to borrow more now in order to take advantage of historically low interest rates. And so, if you're an investor in the bond market, why would you choose to lend to the UK government now at such low interest rates? One thing that investors prize above all else in these uncertain times is certainty of cash flows. As a result, they may well be willing to accept a lower return in exchange for increased certainty of getting a positive return at all. So I think we're likely to see a combination of all three levers being pulled. We'll most likely see some spending cuts. We're also fairly certain to see some tax rises. But the vast majority of the coronavirus bailout is going to end up being funded by additional government borrowing. So, when the government needs to borrow money, where does it turn to? Now, additional government borrowing may not be as scary as it sounds. Let's not forget that we can't compare government finances to those of a family on a budget. Why? Well, because the government can turn to the Bank of England, which in the UK has the sole authority to regulate the money supply. So the Bank of England can, theoretically, create money out of thin air. This money can then be given to the government to spend. Let's look at that in some more detail. Now, there are two ways in which the Bank of England creates money. First, as I'm sure you're well aware, is through something called quantitative easing, a term that over the past decade or so you'll have become a lot more familiar with. Let's remember that there was a time pre-2008 when quantitative easing was deemed an unorthodox policy choice by a central bank. Now it seems like it's found its rightful place in a central bank's toolkit. But how does it really work? Let's look at that now. So when a central bank engages in quantitative easing, what it's really doing is increasing the money supply in order to get the economy going again. This is popularly thought of as printing money. In reality, what's happening is the Bank of England is electronically crediting the Treasury's account with additional hundreds of billions of pounds. This money, however, doesn't just sit on account at the Treasury. The Treasury will lend it out at incredibly low interest rates to commercial banks. In fact, in the Eurozone, the European Central Bank has recently made a habit of lending out its newly created money at negative interest rates to commercial banks. So what that means is that commercial banks in the Eurozone have to pay the European Central Bank should they wish to keep money which should be being lent out to customers and businesses on account at the central bank. So these cheap lines of credit that the Bank of England has created through quantitative easing find their way onto the balance sheets of commercial banks. They in turn lend out the money at incredibly cheap rates to consumers and businesses, so that they're more inclined to borrow to invest so that the economy can get moving again. So far so good. Now, the second way in which the Bank of England can create money out of thin air is through what's called monetary financing. This is where the central bank directly buys government debt. It sounds simple, right? If you're a government and you want to issue debt, you turn to your central bank and your central bank buys it from you. Well, that's okay in the short term at the very least. But it's not really sustainable in the long run, purely because if you're a government and you're selling debt to your own central bank, what you're doing is increasing the amount of money in your economy seemingly beyond measure. And so eventually, like we've seen historically in Weimar Germany, or in Hungary in the 1950s, or more recently in Zimbabwe or Venezuela, that will eventually lead to hyperinflation. And of course, nobody wants to be going to a supermarket with a wheelbarrow full of cash in order to buy a loaf of bread, now do they? Now, there's one other group of people that the government can turn to when it wants to borrow money. People and businesses, essentially you and me. How does this work? Well, when an investor or an individual buys government debt in the form of a government bond, what they're doing is they're giving the government money now in exchange for a promise that the government will make payments annually for a certain number of years in the future. But it goes a step further than that. So the money that the government has borrowed from people and businesses finds its way into the pockets of people and businesses through government relief programs. That money is then spent in the economy, which translates to economic growth. But a proportion of that money is going to end up being saved by people and businesses. This proportion which they're saving can be spent on future government debt at a future time. And so effectively, the government can borrow money now from people and businesses, give them that money back in the form of a relief program, and then in future borrow the same money it previously borrowed from them in order to be able to fund a future relief program when a future economic crisis happens. So the government is in effect borrowing the same money multiple times over. This is only sustainable, however, for as long as investors continue to believe that the government will stand behind its obligations to repay the money that it's borrowed. So in this video, we've covered how the government is going to pay for the coronavirus bailout. This will be a combination of public spending cuts, tax rises, and very much more borrowing. We've also covered where the government borrows money from. It can borrow from the Bank of England in two ways: monetary financing and quantitative easing. It can also turn to private individuals. Now, I hope you found this video useful. In my next few videos, I'm going to be shifting gears slightly and looking at how you can get started in investing. The focus of my next video is going to be gold. Is now a good time to buy it? Once you've bought it, should you ever sell it? I'll be telling you all that and much more in my next video. I'll see you then.